Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Welcome to Foundations, and let's get started. So, on our agenda today, we have the Music Education History Timeline. We're going to look back at the past to see where and how we have gotten to where we are today. We're going to look at the origins of the song "Oh Music." Basically, on our agenda is Chapter 7. Thursday, we will discuss Chapter 8. So, let's get started. So here are 16 items that date back to, I believe, 400 BC and all the way to the present that have made our system, our system of music education what it is today. We're going to highlight some of these things and see how they all fit into the big picture. So we go all the way back to 400 BC, where we start with Plato and his writings. In this time, Plato advocated for music to be part of each citizen's education, not for music's sake, but because it made better moral citizens. So it contributed to the moral character of people, and that's why Plato wanted music included in education. So then we move into the early universities in the 1200s, where music was considered an integral part of a liberal arts education. That education being music, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. I will note here that a liberal education, you'll often hear it spoken of in derogatory terms, but let's look at the actual definition. It's approach to learning that empowers you to deal with complexity, diversity, and change, giving you a broad knowledge of the wider world, as well as an in-depth study of a specific interest, in this case, music. Helps you develop a sense of social responsibility, as well as strong and transferable intellectual and practical skills such as communication, problem solving, and the ability to apply knowledge and skills to real-world settings. All right. So you're probably all familiar with the term conservatory. A conservatory is a specialized school for the study of music, but in the 1500s, especially in Italy, it referred to an orphanage. In Italian, the word for orphanage is somewhat related to the word for conservatory. And a good example would be the all-girl orphanage at which Antonio Vivaldi worked. You string players probably know that name. And he both taught the girls at the orphanage to play string instruments as well as composed music for them, some of which you probably will recognize. Let's hear a clip. So now we finally move into music education in early America. So this begins in the 1700s. The Americas had just been colonized by the Europeans, and John Tufts, a minister, started singing schools because there was not a lot of music education while they were busy just trying to survive in this new world. So he started these singing schools, and as he was a minister, they were based primarily around singing of hymns and psalms. In fact, Tufts is actually responsible for the first music education text in the United States in the early 1700s, an introduction to the singing of psalm tunes in a plain and easy method with a collection of tunes in 3 parts. That's his textbook up there on the left. He also developed, there's a little excerpt in the upper right of one of the tunes. That tune's called Windsor. but it featured his own brand of solfege. So rather than the standard solfege of do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, John Tufts had his solfege with only fa, sol, la, mi, fa. Fa, sol, la, mi, fa, which eventually evolved into shape note singing. Now, you've got to watch this next clip. I want you to take a moment and watch this YouTube about shape note singing in the United States. It's a really very unique sound. I can't explain it. You've got to experience it. So take a moment and watch the YouTube. So now in our historical journey, we get into a more philosophical piece, and that is from the Swiss educator Pestalozzi. Now, Pestalozzi, Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, you don't need to necessarily know his first name, but hang on to the last name Pestalozzi. He had a major influence on the way we teach music in, well, really everywhere, but especially in the United States. He himself never came to the United States, but two of his followers did live in the U.S., and they were strong proponents of Pestalozzian principles, or his philosophy of teaching. And those people were George Nageli and Joseph Neff. You don't necessarily need to remember those names. Pestalozzi is the big name you need to remember here. And the Pestalozzian principles of sound before symbol. That is, learning a tune first, having it in your ear, being able to sing it, and then being able to play it and see the notation of it. Also an active approach rather than a passive learning approach. Teaching one concept at a time is also a Pestalozzian principle. That would be focusing on rhythm, and then another day focusing on melody, and then another day focusing on expression. All students, but especially young students, can get very confused if you try to do rhythm and melody at the same time, for example. So it was Pestalozzi who discovered, if we focus on one concept at a time, they will be able to master that concept. And that's number 4, achieving mastery on a concept before you move on. Number 5, practicing first, then giving the principles in theory. That really harkens back to sound before symbol. You practice it, and then you show the notation. Analyzing and practicing elements of articulate sounds to then apply to music, and then making the names of the notes correspond to those used in instrumental music. That may sound kind of odd to you, but that has to do with, you go back to the solfege. In some countries, they use solfege for the names of the notes. Well, at least in the U.S., we use letter names for the names of the notes, and making those names of the notes correspond to those used in instrumental music. That's what he's speaking of there. The main one I want to highlight, though, is sound before symbol and active rather than passive learning, and teaching one concept at a time. And now we come to the 1800s, moving right along, aren't we? Just zipping through history. And we get to Lowell Mason. Now, Lowell Mason, definitely a name you need to hang on to. Definitely a name you need to know. Lowell Mason is considered the father of music education in the United States. He petitioned the Boston School Board to include vocal music in the school curriculum in the 1800s. He was a wealthy member of Boston society, and he believed music should be in the curriculum because it contributed to the intellectual, moral, and physical growth of a human being. Intellectually, you know how music can challenge your mind. Morally, the words we sing, or the words they would sing at that time, would contribute to their moral growth. And then finally, and I find this quite funny, the physical growth. Physical growth was heartened by music through breathing. It was good for the lungs. Hey, whatever. Interestingly, he was later fired by the Boston Public Schools, but he is still considered the father of music education. Lowell Mason and the song "Oh Music" is one of his. He was a composer, and that's one tune that he composed. Now, lest you think it was all about vocal music, which, well, actually it was all pretty much about vocal music until around 1850. And this is when the wind band movement begins. Now, I want you to take a moment and think, what could be happening in 1850 that we would want a band for? And if you look at those images on the slide, I bet you're discerning that it was the Civil War, and you are correct. So military bands start to really grow in popularity, and, well, there's a lot of them around the middle of the 1800s because of the Civil War, which is when John Philip Sousa comes into prominence, and along with the wind band movement. Okay, and now we move into the 1900s. This is when Philip C. Hayden, he was a music supervisor. In other words, he supervised music teachers over in a city. In this case, it was in Illinois. And Philip C. Hayden decided there should be a national conference. So he and many of his colleagues across the nation, through the use of Music School Monthly, a magazine which he was the editor of, they actually had a national conference in, I want to say, 1907. And of all places, it was in Iowa. And this Music Supervisors National Conference, MSNC, in 1934, this organization becomes known as the Music Educators National Conference, or MENC. Then in 1998, this becomes MENC, the National Association for Music Education. And then finally, in 2011, this same organization, started by Philip Hayden in the early 1900s, becomes known as the National Association for Music Education. So that's a quick timeline just on the development of one of our national organizations. So we move ahead now to the 1950s. I know we've skipped ahead quite a bit. We're moving just past World War II. So everyone is coming home. The war is over, and the quote-unquote good guys have won. So in the 1950s, we develop a Cold War with, at that time, the USSR, now known as Russia. We develop a space race with them, and this has the effect in the U.S. On education of emphasizing math and science, which diminishes the presence of music in the schools. So the Music Educators National Conference, of course now known as NAFME, starts to advocate and fight effectively for its inclusion. At the same time, all those soldiers coming home from the war, there is a huge baby boom. Financially, everyone, the nation is booming financially, and lots of babies are being born, huge growth in the number of children, school children. So this helps school music programs see unprecedented growth. Of course, now all those babies are the boomers, to whom we say, okay, boomer. So now we move into the 1960s, and a very important piece of legislation that has affected education and continues to affect education today. So, and that is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, or ESEA. So this was signed in 65 by President Lyndon Johnson. There he is in the picture, sitting aside his first grade teacher. This was part of his war on poverty. This was a many pieces of legislation that LBJ, as he was known, advocated for to fight poverty. He believed in the power of education because he himself had been a teacher in his younger days. And the ESEA is considered the most influential education legislation ever passed. It mandated funds to primary and secondary education and sought to improve the educational opportunities for disadvantaged children. A big piece of the ESEA are the titles. There's titles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I believe it goes to 7. But I want to focus on the first 3 titles. So Title 1, you may have heard of that term, a Title 1 school. A Title I school is a school in which I believe it's 40% or more of the children attending that school live in low-income households. So Title I funds, their aim is to close the educational gap between those living in poverty and those in the middle class. Shelby County Schools is considered a Title I district. All the schools in Shelby County Schools are Title I schools. Title II provides funds for teacher training to have highly effective teachers. And then Title III was specifically for arts education. So this was money available for the funding of arts education. So as we move into the 60s, there's a lot going on with the profession in terms of defining itself. So in 1967, there was a conference held in Tanglewood, Massachusetts, known as the Tanglewood Symposium. This brought together music educators and music representatives in business, industry, and actual government. There were a lot of composers there. It was really rather an interesting mix of people. So their purpose was to plan MENC's future. Remember, MENC, now NAFME, but at that time, Music Educators National Conference. So they were there to plan the future direction by defining the role of music education in an evolving U.S. society. And out of this grew the Tanglewood Declaration. Now, I want you to think for a moment what was going on in the 60s. I know you were not even born then, but there was the Vietnam War. There were civil rights protests throughout the country. Of course, I believe you know that in 68, Martin Luther King was assassinated here in Memphis. So a lot of civil unrest. And it's in this environment that the Tanglewood Symposium took place and that they came up with the Tanglewood Declaration, which is a summary of the most important discussions coming out of the Tanglewood Symposium. This is perhaps the profession's most important vision statement in recent times. We're going to take a look at that. So the Tanglewood Symposium, this statement, summarizing statement of what had taken place at the Tanglewood Symposium. There are 8 statements. Here are the first 4. Music serves best when its integrity as an art is maintained. Music of all periods, styles, forms, and culture belong in the curriculum. Let's talk about that for a moment. That probably seems, well, of course, to you, but at that time, that was a revolutionary statement. So they would include music repertory that would include popular teenage music and avant-garde music, American folk music and music of other cultures. This was revolutionary back in the 60s. Schools and colleges should provide adequate time for music and programs ranging from preschool through adult or continuing education. Instruction in the arts should be a general and important part of education in the senior high schools. So it was very common to have music in the elementary schools, but here the symposium focuses on the importance of music as a very important part of the senior high school education, which is something I think we take for granted. You just expect there to be a band, choir, and perhaps orchestra at your high school. But in the 60s, that was not a given. So here, the Tanglewood Symposium is coming up with the statement that yes, this needs to be part of the senior high school just as much as math and science and English would be. Okay, and then the other four statements from the Tanglewood Declaration: developments in educational technology, educational television, programmed instruction, and computer assisted instruction should be applied to music study and research. This probably doesn't seem groundbreaking to you because you have grown up in a very technology rich environment, but in the 60s, this was huge to make this statement that educational technology, what would that be? Well, at that time, it looked like educational television, programmed instruction, computer assisted instruction, computer assisted. That was groundbreaking at that time because computers at that time were as big as, think about the room that we normally have foundations in, 286. That would be the size of a room that would house a computer at that time. Let's move on. Greater emphasis should be placed on helping the individual student fulfill his needs, goals, and potentials. So, individualizing education, which I believe we take as a given. And then music education as a springboard for assisting in the solution of urgent social problems, as in the inner city and other areas of culturally deprived individuals. Now, this one, I don't know. There's a lot of assumptions in that statement. I believe that they're making some big generalizations based on what they believe about poverty and race. But okay, but I think that would have been very of the time because, as I said, at this time there were there was a lot of racial unrest in the United States, lots of protest and sit-ins. Teacher education programs finally must be expanded and improved so that we are putting highly qualified teachers in these music classrooms. And you'll look at that last statement at the end of it, as well as teachers equipped to work with the very young, with adults, with the disadvantaged, and with the emotionally disturbed. A term I don't think we would ever use today, but was kind of the norm at that time. But working with teachers being equipped to work with children with special needs. So all these things were very important things that came out of the Tanglewood Symposium and written down in this Tanglewood Declaration. Okay, a few more things that came out of the 60s. We have the Young Composers Project. In this project, American composers in residence would be in schools. This was originated by composer Norman Delajoio in 1957. It was funded by the Ford Foundation and administered by the National Music Council. So it was a project that placed 31 young composers in schools with an annual stipend of $5,000 in those early years. That doesn't sound like much at that time. That would have been pretty good pay. This eventually evolved into the Contemporary Music Project and continued to be funded by the Ford Foundation with an increased emphasis on creating music in public schools, promoting acceptance of contemporary music, and discovering creative talent among students in the school. So looking for those students who were the bright stars, who were going to be the musicians of tomorrow. Think all you people, all of you students, those type of students. Think about how you stood out at your schools as musicians. So they were looking for those types of people. Now we move into the 70s, and Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. This was legislation that mandated that there be available special education for students with disabilities. You probably don't remember a time when there weren't different types of learners in your classroom. Perhaps you remember a time of being in class with students who had instructional assistants with them or needed accommodations. But there was a time when students with special needs were not in the general education population. They went to their own school. I'm putting up air quotes. But in 1975, this became really, it was approached as a civil right that all children were entitled to a free and fair public education, and this included children with special needs, and that's how this legislation came about. So this had two effects on music education. First of all, it required some music teachers to become competent in teaching children with special needs, and I would say at that time it was some music teachers. Today it is all music teachers. And it also mainstreamed students with disabilities into music classes with their neurotypical peers or typically developing peers. Take a moment to watch this YouTube video about such a student with special needs in his high school band program. I believe it's high school. Take a moment to watch this. So now we move into the Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorizations, that piece of legislation that President Johnson signed back in '65 as part of his war on poverty. Well, this piece of legislation continues throughout all these years, but it is reauthorized every few years by Congress and signed by whoever the president is at that time. So in 1981, Reagan signs the Education Consolidation and Improvement Act. So this was based on actually a report that came out in '83, even though it was signed in '81. There was a report that came out called A Nation at Risk, The Imperative for Educational Reform. This was a report that was very critical of American education, pointing out very many weaknesses, diluted curricula, teachers who were not very good, and just a general lack of academic rigor. So part of this 81 legislation increased academic requirements for graduation. I remember a time when if you were not intending on going to college, you didn't have to take, for instance, as many years of English or as many years of math and science. But this new piece of legislation required that all high school students would graduate with 4 years of English, 3 years of math, 3 years of science, and 3 years of social studies, a year and a half of computer science. And college-bound students were encouraged to take 2 years of a foreign language. Now, what this had the effect of doing is reducing the available electives that you could take, which of course ended up being music. So this would reduce the amount of music that many students could take. Now, in 1994, Bill Clinton comes into office, and the ESEA is once again revised, but this time it's called Improving America's Schools Act. And part of wrapped up in this is the National Standards for Arts Education, what every young American should know and be able to do in the arts, came out in '94 at this same time. And Clinton was very supportive of arts education. He had been very involved in music as he was going through school. He was a sax player. And so his legislation recognizes the importance of the fine arts, not just music, but all the fine arts: dance, music, theater, and visual arts. So that, excuse me, that becomes part of this act. And then in 2002, George Bush the Younger, signs the No Child Left Behind. This is when accountability becomes the big buzzword in education, and this accountability and teachers being accountable for what their students learn is this is measured by testing, increased testing. Most of you have come up through the schools, if you were in public school, through these increased testing, and it just sort of became a norm for you. But it was not like that always. So this increased testing and teacher accountability also has the results of greater focus on math and reading, which is, this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it took time away for arts education. And then finally we move into 2015, and Every Student Succeeds. Further reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act signed by Barack Obama. Once again, part of this is the 2014 music standards, the revised music standards, which we'll talk about quite a bit on Thursday. These come into being, and this recognizes the importance of very specific music goals for our students, and of course, once again, increases music in the schools. So let's take this opportunity to talk about the different types of schools that there are. First, public schools. Many of you are likely very familiar with the public school. Many of you attended public schools. Public schools are federally funded. They're funded through taxes collected through, generally, property taxes. That is, tax collected on property that people own. Public schools have a board of directors and very structured administrative positions. They're generally pretty consistent from school to school. Public schools serve all populations. Teachers in public schools are licensed and highly qualified. Highly qualified is in quotes here because that is actually written into legislation. In fact, it's written into the legislation that was passed. Those reauthorizations of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, when George W. Bush passed his No Child Left Behind, that phrase highly qualified teacher became part of that legislation. So licensed teachers, and not only licensed but highly qualified. And to make them highly qualified, there is funding at public schools for teachers to receive professional development throughout the year. They will have days, you probably remember those days when perhaps you had a holiday as a student, but your teachers were at school. That's because it was one of their professional development days. They will also have funding. I can speak to, as a music educator, funding specifically for music educators and teachers in positions where where you're the only one on campus. They sometimes will have professional development funding for you to attend conferences or attend specialized trainings and workshops that speak directly to your area of expertise. Teachers' positions in public schools are more stable because there are contracts, and teachers need to show growth on their TCAP scores. That is the way Tennessee rates its teachers is through TCAP scores. We'll get into more specific talk about that later. Public schools tend to have more resources because they are simply, as a district, buying things in bulk. They will have like textbooks and just more resources available. I can give you an example that Shelby County Schools, their music division or department will have a lot of resources that can be passed from school to school. I mean, things from scores to instruments to just lots of different things. And then finally, public schools serve all students, and to that end, special needs students must receive accommodations to which they're entitled because it's the law. So that's a brief rundown of public schools. And now let's take a look at private schools. So private schools are not federally funded. Private schools can be church-related or they can be not church-related, often called independent schools. They will also have a board of directors and structured administrative positions. They serve very specific populations. What are those populations? It's the populations who can, who are paying to go to those schools. The teachers may or may not be licensed. They will not often, they will have degrees, but they may have, for example, there may be a biology teacher that has a degree in biology, but not a degree in education or science education. Why would that make a difference? Well, you as future music educators, you're not just learning music, you're also learning, remember all those things we talked about before the midterm, all those skills you're learning. One of those skills, pedagogy, you're learning how to teach. Well, teachers who are not licensed to teach may not have those pedagogical skills. They may know their subject very, very well, but they may not be skilled in actually how to get that across to their students. Teachers may or may not receive professional development throughout the year. It's kind of up to, the funding and what that administrator's emphasis is going to be, whether or not a teacher will receive professional development funding. Teachers' positions may also not be stable due to funding. In fact, interesting note that since this pandemic crisis and the closure of all the schools, I have seen I have heard several stories about private school music teachers losing their jobs because the schools have had to close, and the administrators at these private schools want to keep paying their teachers, and they've had to pick and choose. So I've read more than a few stories about private school music teachers losing their jobs as an attempt to keep the quote-unquote other teachers receiving a paycheck, which is just really tragic. But this is part of, or can be part of private school life, that there may be different contracts drawn up. They may be, kind of last hired, first fired. And so something to consider. Special needs students in private schools may or may not receive accommodations, and this is also very important, the teachers in those private schools may not have the training to meet those students' needs. And last but not least, charter schools. Okay, now charter schools are interesting entities. They are federally funded. In fact, It comes from the funding that the money that funds charter schools comes from the very same money that funds public schools. In fact, charter schools actually get some of the money that would normally go to public schools. It's pulled into these charters to support them. So there is a board of directors and multiple leadership positions. More often, they serve low socioeconomic status students and more minority populations. You can think about charter schools in Memphis and students that they serve. For instance, the school in this picture is the Soulsville Academy. A lot of guidelines, often very structured discipline. I'm speaking generally of charter schools, not anyone specific. They usually pay more, including if you have a master's degree. However, teachers may or may not be certified in their subject areas. They will have degrees, but not. It's sort of the same story as I told you with the private schools, where you might have a biology teacher who has a degree in biology, but not necessarily in science education. So teachers, there is that, variety of training that the teachers will have, training and experience. Teachers' positions may not be stable also due to limited contracts. They do have to show growth on their TCAP scores, just like the public schools. Now, the private schools do not have to do that. Sometimes charter schools will have a lottery for openings. You probably heard about that they will have, parents waiting all night to sign up for a specific charter school in the hopes that they will get their child into a specific school. I don't know of that happening as much here in Memphis, but about 10 years ago, that was kind of the norm in charter schools in New York City. And then finally, special needs students may or may not receive accommodations in charter schools. And this goes once again to teacher training, because very specific training goes into learning about how you meet the needs of all students. And that's something that comes through having an education degree, which you will have as a music educator, and you will have these skills, you will have these tools, but not all teachers in charter schools or private schools necessarily have these skills, because they may or may not be certified educators. So that's a quick rundown of different types of schools. All right, let's do a quick overview of where we are on the course timeline. If you will log into eCourseware, there's a newly revised syllabus up. The last page of that syllabus has this timeline. And let's see, 326 Field Experience Reflection 2 is due to eCourseware. If you have not done that, I will still accept it. Please tend to that. On the 31st, the Border Crossing Project was due to eCourseware. And then on the 2nd, Field Experience Reflection 3 was due to eCourseware. Again, if you have not done any or all of these assignments, I will still accept them. Please get this done. If you're having an issue with technology, please contact me and I'll figure out something to help you. Okay, so we were right here, Development of the Profession. That was the 7th. For next time, What Do We Teach? Hoffer, Chapter 8. And then be aware that on Friday, Field Experience Reflection 4 is due to eCourseware. Unfortunately, all these field experiences are via YouTube. It's too bad that the situation is the way it is, but we cannot get into the schools. So, step back and punt and do our very best. I know this is a challenging time. Please hang in there. I hope you are all doing well. And let's take a look at next time. So, yes, for next time, we will discuss Chapter 8 in the textbook, the content of music classes and rehearsals. What do we teach in those classes? So, have a great day. Wash your hands, wear a mask, stay socially distant, but stay in touch. Take care, guys. Bye.